Well, hello and welcome to Insight with political tours and beyond the headlines. Over the past 2 decades, London has become a global centre for organised crime, oligarchs and kleptocrats to stash away their money. Some states too see the UK as an easy haven to fund themselves and others and undermine democracy in the process. Our guest today is here to explain how they do it, why it's bad for us, and what can be done to stop it. His name is Tom Keatinge, and he's the director of the Centre for Financial Crime and Security Studies at the Royal United Services Institute in London. Hello and welcome, Tom.
Hi, Nicholas. How are you?
Good. We're all well up here on the Welsh borders. I think you are in London with some lovely cartoons on your wall behind you. This is going to be a conversation more broadly about finance policy and how finance policy should play a more central part in domestic and foreign policy everywhere. And this goes well beyond questions about bank regulation, but we'll get onto that in a bit. But just to start with, Tom, can you provide us with some examples of how London is a haven for illicit finance? And we'll spend a bit of time on this. I know people will have sort of some ideas in their head, but I know you've got some sort of concrete and differing examples of how this works.
Yeah, sure. And I'm in the New Forest, actually, so almost as wild as you. So I think it's easy to think of illicit finance as dirty money moving around the world and, does anyone suffer? And I think it's really important to understand, in particular, the way in which illicit finance can impact human rights. So a particular case that I had the opportunity to work on with the BBC and The Guardian beginning of last year was what was known as the Luanda leaks. So this is the story of Isabel dos Santos, the daughter of the former president, who essentially used that position to denude the country of financial wealth, but not just to do that for her own gain, but at the same time, for example, forcing the displacement and relocation of citizens in order to develop prime real estate to benefit herself, and in forcing this displacement, just dumping people in camps where there was no proper sewage and all that sort of stuff. So, what you see on the front page of the newspaper as an illicit finance scandal involving Dubai and Switzerland and the UK, and the UK is a frequent feature, has a human face. And I think it's really important to remember that is the consequence of illicit finance. Yes, people are getting rich. Yes, they are buying yachts and nice properties, but it's almost a zero-sum game. The winners basically are accompanied by losers, and those losers are the populations in these countries. And in the case of
so that's a sort of really very obvious case. We know we don't want to be handling people who've made their money that way. I mean, quite simply, it seems immoral. One should say that Isabel dos Santos denies most of those, all of those allegations put against her, I think.
Yes, she does. Yeah, she does. I mean, look, there are other examples that one can turn to. So, for example, in the Gambia, we have the situation of the former president, Yahya Jammeh, who basically used the government social security fund to pay for his kind of new private jet and other extravagances. And the result of that was that pensioners went without pensions and couldn't afford to buy rice. So, I mean, this is my point about, you have these kind of winners in inverted commas, but then there is a massive downside. And we often overlook that downside because, of course, we in London get obsessed about what's going on with the money flows in the skyscrapers. But it's important to remember that there are some real losers in all of this.
Yeah. Those are perhaps the more simple examples. I guess it can get more complex. And I think Russia's probably a prime example. And we all know about the oligarchs. And one could say, well, look, these are owners of big companies. They're serious investors. Why not have their money to back a major football club or, invest in the UK? We're open for business. And, a lot of shady things happened in the 1990s, but we can't really go back there and deal with that. This is the reality.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's true. And that this is in a way where the UK comes into the story. I mean, the UK has been a financial entrepot back to the 1600s with the founding of Lloyd's of London and so on. Interestingly, in the kind of 1960s, the UK set itself up as the kind of ultimate offshore tax haven, because people who wanted to raise money were in the United States found that they could raise it free of tax offshore in what became known as the Eurobond market, based centered on London. And really, since then, the UK has always put itself out there as being this sort of slightly freewheeling financial center. You know, don't be fooled by the top hats and all of that, which we used to wear. And right at bang up to date, still, I mean, David Cameron famously said before he became prime minister, he said at a time when the US was ramping up regulation, the UK will benefit from over-regulation elsewhere in the world. So the money carpet has always been rolled out in London. And I think this idea that there are human harms associated with illicit finance, whether it's in Russia or anywhere else, has, I think, eluded people for a long time. And that's why London has boomed in the way it has done.
You're saying two things there, I think. You're talking about London's history as a sort of a center of international finance and in encouraging sort of financial invention and Lloyd's and coffee shops, and we can think about that sort of long history. But I think you're also something more specific, which is there are vehicles that London has become very good at setting up, which really disguise where the money has come from in order to protect those people from, well, in the US example you're talking about is really about taxation.
Yeah, no, that's correct. And let's remember, when we talk about the UK and finance, we're not just talking about London or indeed the British Isles. We're talking about the overseas territories and the Crown dependencies, many of which have rely on financial services for their livelihood. So thinking about places like Cayman or the British Virgin Islands. And the way in which they have operated has led them to be abused by those looking for the rule of law that the UK offers, all the stability of operating in the UK financial environment with the cloak of secrecy, which for many years the overseas territories and indeed the UK have offered. So it's kind of a perfect storm. I mean, the way I like to imagine it is if you're a money launderer and you're going to the money laundering superstore, you head straight for the aisle marked United Kingdom, because you can get everything in that aisle. You can get lawyers, you can get the accountants, you can get the complex structures, the investment opportunities, the real estate to buy, everything's there. You don't need to go anywhere else.
Let's go back a step, and I just want to try and sort of get into one of these examples to try and illustrate these contradictions, if you like. And looking at Russian investments here, I know, I think it was in 2017, there was a major launch on the London Stock Exchange of a company that Oleg Deripaska was involved in. Can you just talk a bit about that? Because that, for me, seemed to illustrate the enormous contradictions of London being open to all this money, yet at the same time saying we can't deal with the Kremlin or the way it behaves and it needs to be punished and we need to put sanctions on them. And here it seemed to me an example of something we clearly shouldn't be doing, accepting Russian money, but just tell us how that worked.
Yeah, so there are various points at play here. The first is listing on the London Stock Exchange is a kind of badge of honor. You are welcomed then into sort of the financial elite at that point. So everybody wants to list in London or indeed in New York, but particularly in London. That's the first thing. The second thing is the City of London and its capabilities is a huge export. So there was for quite some time through the City UK, which sort of a lobby marketing group, the City of London, a big push to help Moscow develop its financial center, its financial capabilities. So there was a real desire to do exchange of knowledge and to bring business to the UK, and that's most visible in all the kind of listings that occurred, whether they were related to Deripaska, whether we're talking about Rosneft, all these listings that occurred. And I remember I worked at JP Morgan for 20 years, and I remember a heated discussion going on in the corridors of the bank, which was, should we be accepting the opportunity to be the underwriter of one of those IPOs? Because some people in the bank argued we're IPOing stolen assets. We're essentially doing a giant money laundering scheme for an oligarch who has either stolen assets or got them on the cheap in Russia. So the UK has essentially, for a long period, really from the collapse of the Cold War, and certainly from the collapse of the Russian economy in the late 90s, has offered a kind of fig leaf of respectability to Russian individuals, Russian organizations. And for 20, 25 years, they've made hay. And we can talk about what might happen next, but it's very, very difficult to roll that back. It's completely embedded. If you've read Catherine Belton's book, Putin's People, you can kind of see in that how the financial magnet that is London has anchored so much of what that country has done internationally.
I can understand how perhaps in as I said earlier, one could say, look, the 1990s were a very unstable political time, and Russia made this transition to capitalism in terms that we might not like, but that's a reality, and therefore you accept the money. But the point is that the money is still being accepted right up to today. And that launch that I talked about was in 2017. Yeah. Russia was clearly involved in Ukraine. Rusal had donated, it spent money donated money to the military, or military hardware, involved in military hardware. And that just doesn't seem to make sense to me at all. And I'm wondering how, what the regulators here in the UK, what their attitude is to it at that time. Also the firms involved. I mean, you talked about JP Morgan making those questions, posing those questions at an earlier stage. Surely by 2017, 2018, people were saying this is beyond the pale.
If you had, Tom Tugendhat, chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee in Parliament here right now, he'd be exploding at this point, because this is an issue that a number of parliamentarians have felt extremely strong about. But for whatever reason, and I can't tell you what that is, but there is almost a kind of a separation of church and state, except for it's a separation of finance and state in this case. And as long as the finance industry could perhaps continues to generate the profits it doesn't really bring the country into disrepute, arguably it has done, then it has really been allowed to kind of continue fairly unchecked. Now, there are reputable law firms involved in these IPOs and so on who are making sure that due diligence is done properly and all the rest of it. But, I know from my own experience that if you squint hard enough, you can make most unpleasant things look palatable. I know for a fact from work that I've done that the listing authority, so the bit of the Financial Conduct Authority that basically approves listings on the stock exchange, has questioned some of the decisions it's made as relates to Russian listings over the years. But, it's very difficult. Once the money is in the system, it's extremely difficult to winkle it out. And that's in a way a legacy that we'll be living with in the UK for some time to come, even if we stopped tomorrow allowing any more of this money to come in.
Your argument is that government needs to treat this in a different way. I guess so far there's legislation about anti-money laundering. Who can register what companies. The regulation that really affects the banks and how they deal with money and where money comes from. But you're saying that in actual fact the policy needs to be thought out in a much broader way. And the reflection of politicians at the moment has been sort of too narrowly focused. Is that right?
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, so the upside of being a financial centre in the way the UK is that there are a lot of levers you can pull. So, we see all this debate at the moment around the most recent sanctions related to Russia that the United States have issued. About how do you restrict the activity of fundraising by Russian companies or by Russian banks? There are some very powerful levers that you can pull, but the UK has to date tiptoed around those choices and has really focused on saying to the banks, come on banks, you need to be doing better, know your customer checks and all of that. There are some basic things that they could do that would be nuclear financial options. So if you said, no bank operating in London can touch Russian debt, for example, there are some nuclear options you can take, but we don't seem to be brave enough to take those. Maybe we will do. Obviously the government is a bit more muscular nowadays, but we need to sit and look what are the tools that we have to use, and let's use them properly rather than putting all our eggs in this one basket, which is come on banks, do a better job. And there's also, sorry, just to say, there's also a huge, maybe we'll get onto this, but there's a huge intelligence dividend in all of this as well. So there is a form of illicit finance which is almost impossible to spot if you're a bank, which is clean money to be put to illicit purposes. So financing of the undermining of democracy and so on, which is a big focus at the moment, as we see from Joe Biden and from the British government as well.
And this is taking place in a sort of particular time for the UK. We've got people listening in Australia, we've got people listening in the US, and also people in the UK. I think there are lessons here for globally, but the UK is interesting at the moment because we've left the European Union, and the government has deliberately put up this idea of global Britain, that Britain is facing the world, and that London as a financial centre is a key part of it. And you're saying they're missing a trick here.
Yeah, I am. I mean, there's no doubt that London as a financial centre should be a force for good around the world, and I think most people would probably agree that it is. But in some areas, it really isn't. I mean, I'll give you if you allow me, just a kind of short story. I found myself in Pakistan in late 2018, and I went to one of the meetings I had was with I thought it was going to be with a university professor near Islamabad. It turned out this guy was a former deputy minister of finance, which I hadn't done my research properly. And it also turned out that he gathered about 20 of his mates for this meeting. So me and a colleague turn up and we walk in, and for about 15 or 20 minutes, we were harangued. We could not get a word out. We were harangued because they had seen that we were from the Royal United Services Institute with an office on Whitehall, and they assumed we were from the British government. And the haranguing was basically, to summarize it, was you guys spend all your time telling us we're causing you problems with drugs and this and that and the other. Have you ever stopped for a second to think about the trouble you cause us by welcoming in the money of former prime ministers and that basically are stealing from our country? When are you going to say to us, what can we do for you, Pakistan, rather than constantly haranguing us? Anyway, we eventually put them straight, and then we had quite a productive conversation. But it was quite interesting to just feel see that side of the UK.
Yeah, I want people to start putting questions in the Q&A box. So wherever it is on your screen, bottom right hand side in front of me here. I know it's elsewhere on other people's screens, and so you can put your questions to Tom. I want to sort of draw you out a bit on how you actually tackle this and why it's not being tackled, but also talk about some of the. I mean, you've had a very in the last. How long have you been with RUSI? It's about sort of 8 years.
7 years, yeah.
7 years. And you've given evidence in Parliament. You've given evidence to Congress. You've spoken to the UN. How does the rest of the world view Britain's approach to this at the moment, and particularly the US?
Look, I guess the way I would summarize it is that without going into kind of government geekery, so the UK has recently published this thing called Integrated Review, which is essentially the Johnson government's strategy for foreign policy, defense, security over the next 5 years. And that document has been pending for about a year. And so the likes of I have been trying to get Downing Street to have conversations about illicit finance. This is important to national security, yada, yada, yada. No interest. November last year, a change in the White House. Read a few speeches from Joe Biden and Jake Sullivan, his national security advisor, and suddenly you realize that it's a topic that matters to them. And I get a phone call from number 10 saying, we now realize that illicit finance is a foreign policy issue for the United Kingdom. Let's talk. So I think the UK, I think, is feeling pressure from the United States. There's no doubt about that. We all remember the anti-corruption summit that David Cameron hosted in 2016. There was that famous when he was caught on mic saying that these countries are fantastically corrupt, and someone asked President Buhari of Nigeria, do you want an apology? And his response was, no, I want my money back. So from all directions, the UK is seen as a problem, and has not really, for whatever reason, either thought it necessary to deal with that or felt that it's a priority. My personal view is that over the next 3 or 4 years, I think the UK will find it very difficult to ignore that issue because it's trying to do trade deals with countries that will say, well, hang on a minute, before we talk trade, we want, whatever it is that's invested in a Hyde Park apartment back. There's a lot of pressure from the US. I mean, we're a fairly unique research program in the think tank world in London, and I am bombarded by phone calls from people in Washington saying, what should we do? How do we access the right people in government? It's night and day change from before the November election in the US. So I think my personal view is, as I said before, the UK is a financial force for good in the world, but at the moment, it's part of the problem rather than part of the solution, unfortunately.
Okay. I read the Parliament's report on Russian, it was called, I think it was Moscow's Gold. In 2018, which is, I urge people, if you're watching this, it's only about 16 pages long, maybe a bit longer than that. It's really well worth reading. And Tom, you gave evidence to that, as you said earlier, but it's a gripping read. I don't want to get bogged down too much on Russia, because that's quite specific. It relates to across the board of sanctions on a whole range of things. But can you give us an example? Let's go back to the Dos Santos case, or on a case where you've got somebody who's clearly taken money illicitly and is trying to, is bringing that into the UK. What are the measures you think what are the measures that exist now, and what needs to be done? Well,
so I think one of the things that we overlook is that there is an ecosystem of people involved in the movement of finance around the world. So by that, I mean, we have the banks, obviously, where the money ends up, or the investment companies, the money ends up, but you've got accountants, consultants, lawyers providing opinions and so on. So if you look at the Dos Santos case, you find that actually it was kind of lawyers and accountants, the people setting up the companies, who, if you like, allowed the money to breach the defenses. And once the money has breached the defenses, often, and I'm not an apologist for the banks, but often the banks actually, there's not much they can do, because they're told by a law firm, our client's money is clean and please welcome it in. So I think this is I guess another failing, which is we've focused very much on the banks, because people kind of understand banks, that's where money is. Banks are the ones moving the money around the world. Let's focus on the banks. But there are all these, people call them gatekeepers or enablers, who in a way are the kind of bottom feeders in all of this, but they really do come up with the structures and the ideas that allow these individuals to move money around the world. And they're guns for hire. They really are. They're guns for hire.
And that really does raise the question. I mean, because they're used to creating quite complex vehicles to put these investments in place. And I do wonder whether it's somebody in the Serious Fraud Office or CID is going to be able to do all of that. I mean, you actually have to have a lot of manpower and people who really understand finance at the same time.
Yeah, I've we convene roundtables at RUSI all the time, and I remember sitting there, and this lawyer was sitting, this accountant was sitting next to one of the senior police people, and said, when you send me these suspicious activity reports, if you're a so-called reporting entity, you have to file a suspicious activity report if you see something untoward. He said, when you file these things with us, I have no idea what they mean. They're dozens of pages long. I'm used to banks filing them, which says, Bob has asked us to send money to Syria, we've blocked it. That's it. But these ones filed by lawyers and accountants are deeply, deeply complex. You need to be a forensic accountant to understand them. So, yeah, I mean, it
sort of sounds like there's no solution then. I mean, London is very, very good at doing this, been doing it for decades. It sounds like you're not going to get around it.
No, I think that there is a solution, which is that you need to fear your regulator. You need to fear that you'll have your license taken away, and that's why I say the focus has been on the banks, the supervisors, the legal supervisors. The SRA in the UK is actually quite strong, but those that supervise the accountants, the estate agents, all these guys, I mean, they really have got no teeth at all.
Just before we start taking questions, I think this has been a really valuable sort of introduction and overview, and I think we can get into a bit more sort of nitty-gritty now. Can you just give us one or two more examples of where, egregious examples of finance money that's clearly been ill-gotten? I mean, we can all think of Russians owning huge houses and estates across the UK. That might be an example. If you can give us a couple more sort of concrete examples.
I'll give you one that's quite recent, and the reason I choose this is because actually it's not so much about money; it's about the complex structures and the inability to identify ownership. So if you look at the explosion that happened in Lebanon, in Beirut last year, in the port. Yeah. I'm going to have to read this because it's so complicated. But basically, the ship that had delivered the cargo was owned by a Panamanian company, received its mail in Bulgaria. It was certified in Georgia. It was registered in Moldova. It was leased to a company in the Marshall Islands to deliver a cargo ordered by a company in the UK to Mozambique. Yeah, that's an example of kind of the complexity of corporate structures. And that's why, because there are borders, that's why we just simply struggle to get our arms around anybody who wants to undertake illicit activity, move related finance, and has the wherewithal to set up that kind of complex web of structures. And that's not an uncommon situation to see in the kinds of investigations that are unearthed by illicit finance. So you really
have to have the resources to investigate that kind of thing. That takes a lot of manpower, doesn't it? With people who need to understand all those areas of, whether it's shipping or finance, accounting.
Correct.
Okay, let's start taking some questions in now. We've got Simon Jackson first, followed by not a relative of his, but another Jackson, Paul. Let's go ahead with Simon first. Go ahead, Simon.
Is it Tom's contention that London could not have achieved its position as a preeminent financial centre without dealings in dirty money? I'm also a reformed long-term city type, but I don't defend everything that happened there, but I'm just slightly concerned that the audio is being sprayed a little indiscriminately here.
No, it's not my contention. It's not my contention at all. In fact, I would be one of the first to push back on that. I think there are too many people that say London is only what it is because of the dirty money. That's complete nonsense. The percentage of money that is handled by London, not necessarily flows through London, but is handled by London, is small. I mean, the estimates, and no one has really ever done a proper estimate, and everyone relies on the same number from, was it the IMF or whatever, quite a few years ago. This kind of 2 to 5% of global GDP is made up of illicit finance. Well, I don't know if that's a correct number, but no, it's certainly not. I mean, the UK, I think, given the path that the UK has chosen to take over the years, the UK would, I think, always have been a preeminent financial centre. We might have lower house prices in London if we hadn't dealt with dirty money, but I don't for a second think that the city would not be what it is without dirty money. I think that's a lazy argument when people raise it as well.
Okay, Simon, do you want to come back to that at all? Was that fair enough?
Yeah, I mean, in the early days of my career, I as a baby banker, I worked for Morgan Grenfell in the days before the Big Bang and before insider trading was illegal. And to be honest, some of the stuff I saw there was retrospectively quite shocking. But it was only small. All I saw was fairly small scale, but it was indicative of a moral vacuum. But subsequently, the environment I worked in certainly was actually pretty much scrupulously honest. Yeah. I think, as I say, I think it's I would hate the bad apple. Sorry.
Yeah. Okay.
The bad apples to contaminate the barrel.
Okay.
Nicholas, if I can just pick up on a point there. See, the interesting thing is, Simon, in a way, echoes something I was saying earlier on, which is the focus on the raising of standards in this field has been very much on the banks. It's just worth bearing in mind, if you want to be a banker, you have to work for a bank. If you want to be a lawyer or an accountant, you can live above a chip shop in Camden and have the right plaques on the wall. You don't have to work for a law firm or for an accountancy firm. So I think this whole enabler issue is something that we just haven't got our arms around properly, and it's very difficult to get our arms around.
Okay. Paul Jackson, you've got a good follow-up question here too. Go ahead, Paul.
Yes, hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yep. Yeah, Tom, excellent, well done. It's a subject that I've always wanted to understand more and actually talk to an expert about, because you read different articles and you get lost in them, really. But I got two now, really. One, I used to be on the board of a Channel Lines company, not a financial one, the logistics, the post office, when I retired. And I found myself mixing with the Jersey government and the Jersey elite, if you like. And they're pretty proud of how good boys they are, And I've never had a chance to ask. I've never had a chance to ask anybody: are they good boys, or are they just as bad as everybody else?
Yeah, I mean, the Crown dependencies and the overseas territories have been under tremendous scrutiny over the last 5 to 10 years. Tax evasion, the whole 9 yards. My personal view, again, not a fashionable view, is that actually, if we're talking specifically about the Channel Islands, I actually think they do a pretty good job. Now, the problem is that the way they do a good job is not necessarily agreed to by The Guardian or the BBC or anyone else, because they don't operate transparently in the way that the UK mainland operates. And I'm speaking here specifically about listing of companies and so on their company's register. That's not something that you can query if you're a Guardian journalist. So the assumption is that because it can't be queried by The Guardian, there must be nefarious stuff going on. It's also unfortunate that a lot of these financial scandals have quite a long history. And so there is no doubt that standards were poorer 10, 15 years ago. And so, of course, the scandals that come out reveal the problems of 15 years ago rather than the status quo today.
Tom, talk about some other overseas dependencies like the British Virgin Islands.
Yeah, so look, I mean, the BVI, there are 400,000 companies registered there. It has struggled over the years with the whole issue of secrecy. But again, an example which I think people don't want to notice, which is that about 3 or 4 years ago, the BVI signed an agreement with the UK that it would, within 24 hours or exceptionally within 1 hour, provide any and all information that it holds in its company register to the National Crime Agency on request. And if you ask people in London, are the BVI good citizens when it comes to fighting illicit finance, they will say, yes, we get the information we want immediately. So I think part of the challenge that these places have is they just haven't marketed what they're doing very well. They haven't let the world know this is what we're doing. These are the positives that we are. Now, again, in these scandals, the BVI comes up all the time. Well, in a way, it's not surprising because the BVI registers lots of companies. So it's not perfect, but I don't think it's as bad as it's made out to be in the press. But MPs in London have got the guns out for them and will force them to be transparent sooner rather than later.
Let's take a question from I think Germany next. Georg Blaha, or was it Austria? I can't remember. Georg, go ahead.
I hope it's Austria because that's got a Russian money problem.
Germany.
Yeah, you're both correct. I have an Austrian passport, but I live in Munich, Germany.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. No, I was remembering Nicholas mentioning once that they stopped doing tours to Iran because the handling of the money has become too complicated. And it looks like that if you really want to block off a country from money flows or illicit money flows, if you really wanted it, that you could do it. And I was wondering, what is the case with Russia? Apparently, it's not really wanted, and I was wondering if it has another side to it, that it is a...
That's a really good question, Georg. Tom, that is a crucial thing, because we know that it's individuals that have been targeted more by the UK and not institutions and the whole banks or selling bonds. Russia still does.
Yeah. And yes, I mean there is, and the international community is at pains to always say, it's not Russia we've got a problem with, it's Mr. X or Mr. Y. Well, Georg, you should have a chat with Mutti, because the Germany is a really good example of the geopolitics of this. So with the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, the energy security in much of continental Europe. Are you going to go to war with the Russian financial system and then see the gas turned off? I mean, that happened to Ukraine, right? So it's not inconceivable that might happen. And that's why I think the Americans feel much safer being belligerent towards the Russian financial system, because at the end of the day, they actually haven't got anything to lose. They really have got nothing to lose. I also think the UK could afford to be more belligerent, because actually the UK really hasn't got as much invested in the Russia relationship as a Germany, for example.
Maybe the UK wants to do an informal foreign policy and keep the Russians peaceful by handling their money so the Russians have an interest not to become too warlike.
So in the case of Iran, the kind of the hand grenade was thrown, so sanctions and all of that, which essentially chilled the international banking system from engaging with Iran. End of story. As relates to Russia, at the moment, we choose to use a pea shooter. I can't remember what the German is for pea shooter. I have to apologize me, but we're using our smallest weapon. We're not using, and that's the reality of geopolitics. I mean, one of the things that infuriates me beyond belief is listening to Dominic Raab doing all his chest thumping about, we're issuing sanctions on this person and that person, all the rest of it. It's like, mate, if you really wanted to show that the UK was a force for good, you would stop putting sanctions on the little guys, and you would actually take some steps that genuinely, Saudi Arabia, hello anybody, that genuinely demonstrated that you believed in human rights above all else. But of course, that's pie in the sky.
So what measures could they take against Russia which should show they're being more serious?
Well, so every time there is action taken against the Russian financial system, it's done in a way that causes the maximum headline, i.e. VTB is the subject of sanctions, but it's done in an incredibly benign way. So for example, I think right now, American banks cannot be involved in the primary sale of Russian bank debt, I think is what it is, but they can be involved in the subsequent trading of it. Well, market liquidity is incredibly important. So all you need to do is VTB needs to issue the debt, you hang around for a bit, 21 days later, whatever it is, then the whole international market can start trading it. So why not go the whole way? Why not say it cannot be touched by American banks or banks that operate in the United States? So that's what I mean. It's sort of it's making a big bark, but there's no meaningful bite. The most you mentioned, Nicholas, you mentioned Rusal earlier on. The most effective sanction by accident that we've seen in recent times was when Oleg Deripaska was sanctioned. What was it, three years ago? And people realized that because of his ownership of Rusal, that meant that Rusal was also became subject to sanctions. That messed up the aluminium market overnight. They had that factory in Ireland that they couldn't pay people. I mean, it caused chaos. And then that sanction was walked back and Deripaska reduced his stake, and then Rusal could continue to operate. So that was accidentally a really good example of what you can do with sanctions if you throw a grenade.
Okay, we've got lots more good questions coming in. Mike Hodgson, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, let me unmute. Yes, hi. So I'm in the United States and recently retired from a large bank. Although I wasn't a banker, I sold a product that they had. And about 3 years before I retired, we started rolling out a very robust know your customer process. As a sales guy, it felt really burdensome, to be honest with you. But boy, we had to have articles of incorporation. We had to know the ownership. We had to know the customers, if there were any foreign customers involved. And it was a couple-week process to get a customer onboarded just to go through the KYC process. And I wondered how that compared, if you know, with what happens in England, and or if England's KYC process is robust enough to prevent money from coming in from bad sources.
Tom.
Well, yeah. one of the poorest regulatory environments in the world, certainly relative to responsibility, is the United States. The US does not regulate lawyers, for example, for money laundering purposes, because the lawyers say, oh, client confidentiality, client privilege, we can't possibly report our clients even if they're doing bad stuff. The US has only, on the 1st of January this year, agreed to build a company register that well, it won't be transparent, but at least moves the US from being a long way behind the global standard to still behind the global standard. And as they say, you require more ID in the United States to get a library card than you do to set up a company. Now, the banks, back to my theme, the banks in the United States have been under heavy scrutiny. I mean, I worked for JP Morgan. We went through the ringer 10 or so years ago. The banks have been under heavy scrutiny. So the banks are definitely operating at the top of the global league table when it comes to the kinds of things you're talking about. But the underlying infrastructure in the US remains murky, to put it mildly. You know, the right honourable member for Delaware, who happens to now be president, oversees one of the biggest company factories in the world with no transparency.
Wow. Okay, we've got more questions to pack in here. So let's take Nigel Harley next, followed by Diane Cook. Nigel? I can see you up there. Go ahead, Nigel.
Yep.
We can hear you.
Yes, I just really wanted to ask whether this uncertain relationship between the financial markets and the rest of the EU post-Brexit will have some sort of impact on illicit trading. In other words, do you think the city might become more dependent on it as a result of the uncertainty in future relations?
You know, it's popular at this point to go, oh, the UK is going to become Singapore on Thames, which is shorthand for it's going to become a low regulation environment. Although I have to say, having dealt extensively with the supervisory authorities in Singapore, they are a lot tougher than anyone else I've ever dealt with. So I don't think so. I mean, interestingly, I can't remember the precise details of it, but there was a comment floating around Brussels earlier this year when discussions about, so, you know, sorry if I'm teaching suck eggs, but, you know, obviously the UK wants to continue having these kind of passporting rights, these equivalence rights, so that UK financial institutions can operate in Europe in the way that they've always been able to. And there was a group of MEPs who were saying, well, only if the UK cleans up its, you know, its dirty financial activity, you know, there's no, so they're going to try and use that as leverage over the UK to improve. Now, the EU has its own huge problems. I mean, you know, the big scandals of Danske Bank in Estonia and in Denmark, the big fine for ABN AMRO just the other day. I mean, in a way, the EU is now going through what the UK has been. The EU is not the clean financial system that it would like to portray itself to be. So I don't really see this being a kind of a Brexit EU future relationship issue. And the last thing I would say is that an awful lot of financial institutions operate, you know, in both the UK and on the continent. So they operate to kind of global standards anyway. So I don't see this being a Brexit thing.
I'm going to take another more specific question and go back to Simon Jackson and Annie McMahon. So Annie is with Simon. So if you're there, Annie, go ahead.
And funny enough, we're two former JP Morgan bankers as well.
Uh-huh.
I was very struck to learn that both NatWest and HSBC have decided to no longer accept manage accounts for businesses that accept cryptocurrencies. Despite the loss, article was bemoaning the loss in these profitable opportunities.
We've lost.
Worked out that it's just.
We lost the last bit, Annie. Go ahead, repeat the last bit.
What struck me about this was that the banks may be foregoing profitable business opportunities, but it's just not worth the cost of compliance to do the risk of money laundering with cryptocurrencies.
Yeah, I mean,
and I was wondering, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I think we got the question.
And the question was, is it likely and or desirable that other institutions will follow suit?
Well, Coinbase just IPO'd for $85 billion. So I think that it's going to be something that the banks can't ignore. Look, it's another example. It's another example of where at the moment we're defending the perimeter with the banks, but actually the perimeter is further back. So there are those that then interact with the banks, whether it's the lawyers, accountants. Crypto exchanges are a classic example, right? Crypto exchanges should be doing KYC, should be knowing who their customers are and all of that, so that when they come to the bank and say, hey, we want to make a crypto to fiat transfer using your services, and by the way, we know it's Tom Keatinge and this is who he is and this is where the money came from, yada, yada, yada. So really it's up to the crypto exchanges to demonstrate that they are being as judicious with their customers and their customers' money as the banks are. So, you know, different banks have different risk appetites, but essentially, you know, it won't be long before there are crypto exchanges that can bank equally with HSBC, NatWest, Barclays, JPM Chase, whoever it might be.
Okay, I've got two questions I'm going to combine here, and that's from Andy Mendes and Diane Cook. So let's take Diane Cook first, and then Andy Mendes. Go ahead, Diane.
Tom, it was really your comment about Dominic Raab earlier on. My question is, do you see a spillover from what you've been talking about actually into UK politics? I'm thinking in particular of the overstuffed House of Lords, where there's a price list for having a Lord on your board, particularly if you are a non-UK entity. And maybe we can also see some of it drifting into the House of Commons and our prime ministers even.
So Andy Mendes, do you want to follow that up?
Yeah, it's a sort of similar point, I think, Nicholas. Apologies for not being a banker, first of all. I mean, I did actually make stuff where I worked, but apart from money. But I did just wonder, you've talked quite a lot about the lack of political will. And I do wonder how much of that is related to the size of the donations going into particularly in the UK, into Tory party coffers, but maybe more generally in the capitalist world, that actually money, dirty money, is buying political influence to make sure that there is not too much interference in our activities.
Tom, is that all conspiracy? The stuff is conspiracy theories, or are there elements of truth in that?
Well, look, it's certainly the case that yeah, there are plenty of kind of donor related scandals, and you know, I think there's obviously some of that floating around at the moment. I don't subscribe to the view, and I'm not suggesting either of you saying this, but I don't subscribe to the view which is that the banks are essentially, you know, in the pockets of the politicians. And the reason I say that is because, particularly if you're a globally operating bank, it doesn't matter if you're in the pocket of the UK government, you're actually more answerable to the New York Department of Financial Services, the OCC in the United States. You know, you have global regulators that you have to face down. So I'm not really sure about, I mean, fundamentally, so it's just kind of just very, very briefly, it's worth bearing in mind that historically, if a bank spotted something that it thought was suspicious, it was meant to file a suspicious transaction report. And back in the day, it took kind of 5 days for a payment to clear. There was plenty of time to think about it, have lunch, think about it again, and then make the transfer or report something suspicious. And generally, the way the system works was the private sector was running the banks. Be good chaps, do what needs to be done, keep your noses clean, don't embarrass us. I mean, that's a gross simplification, but essentially the banking was run by the private sector. And that over the years, obviously, has proven to be, in some cases, fatal for banks because they just couldn't be trusted. And so what governments around the world, and the UK is an example, they just haven't invested enough in regulation. There's a Belgian diplomat who said to me once, the problem in the UK is that people don't realize that you're not regulating a banking system of 60 million people, you're regulating a banking system of 8 billion people, and you don't have the right resources arrayed against that. That's what it boils down to, I'm afraid. And yeah, money talks and people will take shortcuts and all the rest of it. But ultimately, the lack of regulation means that there is not the control that there should be.
So what kind of institutions do you want to see? Just tell us what's in place at the moment. I mean, and you can go from, on the intelligence side, things like GCHQ, you can talk about the Serious Fraud Office, and then what are the key regulators? You talk about the infrastructure that's there,
yeah,
and then the kind of thing that you think should be in place.
Sure. So you've got, in the UK, we have 25, I think it is, 27 regulators. You've got the Financial Conduct Authority, which is one everyone's heard of, HMRC, the tax authority, which regulates the companies that set up companies, regulate real estate agents, the Gambling Commission. Then you've got a whole load of professional service, supervisors who, are little guys who regulate notaries and all the rest of it. So the capacity of a lot of these supervisors is very low. That's the first thing. So there isn't, you don't feel you're being supervised in many of those industries. Then you've got the National Crime Agency, which is meant to be kind of investigating economic crime, very stretched for resources, although, they try their best. You've got the Serious Fraud Office, which is doing kind of the highly complex, high profile, multi-year investigations. I think most people would say that has a spotty track record. The law doesn't help the Serious Fraud Office. The Serious Fraud Office would argue. Then you mentioned GCHQ. So GCHQ publicly states that it does get involved in the investigation of organized crime. And obviously the financial elements of organized crime are an interesting trail to investigate. But it's very spotty. It's not particularly well coordinated. I would defy anybody to identify who is the minister who is accountable for combating illicit finance. There isn't one. In fact, interestingly, under Theresa May, Ben Wallace was the security minister. He then had "and economic crime" added to his title, and he actually was very motivated. He used the McMafia TV series, which everyone will remember, as a kind of vehicle for trying to bring the whole issue of illicit finance to life. And then under the Johnson government, the "and economic crime" has been dropped from the portfolio of that minister. So he's just the security minister again. And unfortunately, he's currently on sick leave. So I think we've got the right tools. We've certainly got the right laws, got some of the most powerful laws in the world. We just haven't used them in a coordinated and strategic way, unfortunately.
I just want you to repeat what you wrote in March in response to this, the integrated review. This is the review you mentioned of Britain's whole security policies across defence, across a whole range of sectors. And I mean, your response was pretty damning. Can you just talk about that again?
It's really funny because I got an email this afternoon from someone senior at the FCO, and it said, "Thanks very much for your glass half full review of the integrated review. We thought you'd be more negative than that." So yeah, I think my point was that, so as I said before, I was expecting there to be nothing on illicit finance in the integrated review until I started having those phone calls earlier in the year. I suppose my article basically says, look, there are lots of problems. We cannot hide from the fact that there are lots of problems, and I've talked about some of those here, and I list those in that article. But there is a line in the integrated review that says the UK needs to reinvigorate its response to illicit finance. So that suggests that there is a recognition that current activity is below par. And if that sentiment, if that desire to reinvigorate is true, then I'm optimistic and I'm kind of here to help, as it were. But ultimately, this will boil down to tone from the top. You know, the operational side of government, the policy side of the government, everyone has got way too much to do. And so if Boris Johnson doesn't stand up and do what David Cameron did in 2015 and say, the UK is not the place to stash your dodgy cash, we will do everything we can to find it and to confiscate it, then we're going nowhere. Now, Dominic Raab has tried to do that, but honestly, a bit half-hearted. I don't believe him.
And what you're also saying is because the city is such a key place in global finance, this is an area where the UK can have a significant amount of influence. And actually, in terms of making its mark in the world, this is an area in which it should be, and it would actually get a lot more credit for.
Yeah, no, 100%. So again, back to earlier in the conversation, a global poll will make you realize that people view the UK as part of the problem, part of their problem, importantly. It would be so easy to change that around to being part of the solution, because as you say, we have at our fingertips all the buttons that need to be pressed in order to become part of the solution. We just need to organize ourselves and be brave enough, bluntly, to take that step.
Okay, we just got time for a few more questions. So Sheila de Belague's got a good question. Go ahead, Sheila.
I just wanted to ask, I'm not sure how relevant it is to London's financial role, but Bill Browder and the Magnitsky Acts, have they been effective?
Bill has been relentless. He's been relentless, and I referred to the new corruption sanctions that were introduced in the UK earlier this week. Bill is significantly responsible for that. The UK doesn't call them Magnitsky sanctions, but essentially that's what they are. Both the human rights regime that was brought in last year and the corruption regime that was brought in this year. So the sanctions have been brought in, and Bill's campaign in the United States, here in Canada and Australia, has made it. He has had a tremendous impact. The question is, do these tools have an impact? And I think where I am at the moment is that the Foreign Secretary is a human rights lawyer by background, so he's really attracted to this kind of tool. My fear is that in his toolbox he sees only two tools: human rights sanctions and corruption sanctions, and doesn't realize that there are all the thing about sanctions is that they are a recognition that things have gone wrong. You've had to sanction someone because you've allowed them to be a kleptocrat. Okay. Secondly, if you're sanctioned, if Nicholas Wood is sanctioned, then his assets are frozen, but you have to go through legal due process to seize those assets and to return them to the country in question. And that's the nettle that we don't seem to be able to or willing to grasp at the moment. So we'll happily sanction people, sends a message, looks good in the papers, but does it actually do anything for, back to the very beginning of the conversation, those people in countries who've had their national wealth stolen by a kleptocrat?
I'm going to urge people to go to Rusi's website and also to Tom's own website just to read a few of these articles by way of follow-up. And so hit Rusi's at www.rusi.org. And then Tom's own website is Tom Keatinge, that's Keating with an E on the end, .net. And you can see his selected articles on there. And then lastly, and I think we'll send out a link to this as well, a link to all of these. If you go to the, I think it's well worth reading the Parliamentary Foreign Affairs, I think was it Foreign Affairs Select Committee?
Foreign Affairs, yeah.
Foreign Affairs Select Committee on Russia, which was called Moscow's Gold. And that's if you want a sort of really good overview of how all this works, that select committee is very interesting. Tom, just you got into this, you were with JP Morgan, but it was terrorism and finance. I just want you to share with people some of the other things that you've been doing as well, because illicit finance covers a whole range of things. And I think you were initially looking at the links between terrorism and finance.
Yeah, no, you're right. So yes, I took a year off, did a master's from JP Morgan, studied how terrorist groups are financing themselves, went back to the bank for a year, and then all of a sudden Islamic State appeared, and everybody wanted to find that guy who understands how money works, because money and Islamic State were a powerful cocktail. So yeah, that was my first interest. Nicholas, you and I met on one of your trips to Ukraine. That's an interesting illicit money patch as well, because destabilization in that country is clearly a function of dirty money. And I suppose my fundamental interest is to look at global security problems, but through purely a financial lens. I'm very boring in that regard, but it's a fascinating space, and it's a space where actually there's a lot of talk and a lot of opinion, but I don't think there's nearly enough analysis. And as you can tell from what I've been saying, I don't think there's nearly enough action. And I think the next action, just my last sentence, is that as we get more and more concerned about hostile state activity, HSA, you will hear that coming out of government mouths increasingly. We need to understand the money that drives that hostile state activity, and that will be the next big challenge.
I think I think you're addressing, was it the World Wildlife Fund or a charity dealing with fluffy bunnies, for want of another word? And I think you said to them, "I don't give a damn about the fluffy bunnies, but I do give a damn about money." And that was
that wasn't very popular. I seem to remember the Duke of Cambridge is in the audience as well. But anyway, they all got the point.
Yeah, excellent. Tom, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you very much indeed. I've really enjoyed it. We've all learned a lot. Thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure. Thanks again.